They told the world the AES passport was already dead. Europe rejected it, China refused it. The alliance of Sahel states had failed before it even began. Or did it? This is the story. The world was never meant to hear the political secrets hidden behind headlines, buried under rumors, and twisted into propaganda. What really happened in the first weeks after Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso unveiled their own passport? Why did a symbol of sovereignty suddenly become the target of one of the fastest disinformation campaigns Africa has ever seen? In January 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States stood before the world with courage. A new flag, a central bank, a judiciary, and then their greatest declaration, the AES Biometric Passport. For millions, it meant dignity and freedom. For others, it meant danger. Within days, whispers turned into viral claims. France has denied it. The European Union refuses it. Even China will not accept it. Tens of thousands believed the alliance was collapsing before it had even found its footing. But the truth suppressed, manipulated, and weaponized tells another story. A story that could change how we understand Africa's fight for freedom. If you believe Africa's awakening is more than rumor, stay until the very end. In January of the year 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso stood before the world with one clear message: sovereignty. In the capital cities, flags of the new union were raised, institutions were announced, and then came the most striking symbol of independence, the AES Biometric Passport. This was not presented quietly. It was launched with official ceremony, broadcast across Africa, and carried the full weight of authority. Mali's Minister of Security, Daoud Ali Mohamedini, spoke without hesitation. He declared that the AES passport had the same diplomatic weight as the passport of ECOWAS. It was not symbolic. It was official. It was valid for travel across Africa and beyond the continent. According to his statement, the alliance had already taken the necessary steps with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ensuring that the passport was legally recognized worldwide. This meant that by the very moment of its unveiling, the AES passport was not just a paper document, but a legally valid international travel document. Foreign embassies were notified. Diplomatic missions of China, France, and the European Union were formally informed, and accredited consular offices within the AES region received official communications. Within days, samples of the new passport were submitted for identification and verification. Citizens lined up to receive it, eager to hold in their hands the proof that their nations were no longer bound by the chains of the past. The passport carried more than identification numbers and biometric data. It carried history. It carried the defiance of three nations that had chosen to leave ECOWAS just 1 year earlier, after months of rising tensions and failed negotiations. By January of 2025, they had replaced the old order with new structures: a central bank, a judiciary, a common flag, and now a common passport. This was the turning point. In the eyes of the world, the AES had crossed the line from words to action. A new chapter for Africa had been written. But as history shows, the moment sovereignty is declared, resistance always follows. And soon, that resistance appeared not through armies or weapons, but through rumors. The launch of the AES passport had barely settled into the public consciousness, when the first shockwaves appeared not in quiet corners of social media alone, but in the pages of regional press agencies and the headlines of foreign outlets. The narrative was simple, repeated with confidence. Europe had refused the AES passport, and even China had turned its back. Regional papers carried alarming reports. One article from the West African press declared that consulates in France were systematically rejecting the new travel document, describing it as invalid for visa applications. Headlines were designed to strike at the heart of public trust: AES passport already facing international roadblocks, and China sends clear message: no recognition for Sahel states. The tone was not investigative. It was declarative, leaving readers with the impression that the matter was already settled fact. By mid-February 2025, several French-language dailies in Europe had begun to echo the same claims. They reported that visa applications from Malian citizens had been blocked, attributing the difficulties directly to the new passport. In Beijing, an article carried by a regional agency alleged that China's refusal to accept the document was a deliberate signal of non-recognition, a move meant to isolate the Sahel Alliance. Such stories carried weight far beyond a passing rumor. They bore the imprint of authority, printed in newspapers and broadcast in evening bulletins. Citizens across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, many of whom had celebrated with pride only weeks earlier, were confronted with the possibility that their new symbol of sovereignty was already collapsing. For those who read the headlines without question, the conclusion seemed unavoidable. The AES had launched a passport without international legitimacy, and their attempt at independence was crumbling under diplomatic rejection. It was a perfect storm of official-sounding reports, international echoes, and a public eager for clarity. The sense of betrayal grew quickly. Was the new passport truly recognized, or had the Sahel Alliance misled its people? In those tense days, the very survival of the AES seemed to hang on the answer. As the storm of alarming headlines gained momentum, the governments of the Sahel states could no longer remain silent. Mali's Ministry of Security was the first to respond, issuing a detailed statement to calm both its citizens and the international community. The ministry reminded the public that all diplomatic and consular missions accredited within Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had been formally informed of the AES passport. Physical samples of the new biometric document had already been delivered to embassies and consulates. The only challenge, officials explained, was a short delay in integrating these samples into international systems. European consulates echoed this clarification. Officials in Bamako emphasized that there was no formal rejection of the AES passport by France or by the European Union. Instead, they pointed to administrative timing. Consulates had not yet completed the process of registering the new document in their databases. Once those steps were finished, visa applications would proceed normally. In other words, the obstacle was bureaucratic, not diplomatic. China's response came soon after. On the 26th of February 2025, the Chinese embassy in Mali released a statement through its official channels. It declared that delays in issuing visas were related to routine administrative procedures, not political rejection. The embassy confirmed that it fully recognized the new Malian passport issued under the AES framework. Almost immediately, the same regional press that had once claimed China's refusal was forced to publish new stories admitting that the document was accepted. This sequence revealed something crucial. The supposed crisis had never been rooted in fact. It was born from incomplete procedures, amplified by sensational reporting, and weaponized by those eager to see the Sahel Alliance stumble. Yet the damage had already been done. Tens of thousands across West Africa had read the first alarming headlines. For many, the correction came too late. Trust once shaken is not easily restored. And that was precisely the aim of those who planted the lie. The first impact of the rumors was deeply human. In Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, citizens who had celebrated proudly at the unveiling of the AES passport now faced uncertainty. Students preparing to begin studies in Paris or Brussels feared they would be stranded. Traders who traveled regularly to European markets for goods and contracts delayed their plans. Families seeking urgent medical treatment abroad found themselves caught in limbo as consulates hesitated to process the new document. Each delay was magnified by newspaper headlines declaring that the passport had been rejected. The effect on morale was undeniable. For ordinary citizens, the passport had symbolized dignity. To suddenly hear that it was invalid struck at their faith in the new alliance. In the cafes of Ouagadougou, conversations turned skeptical. Had their leaders acted too boldly, too quickly? Politically, the damage was just as severe. Opponents of the military-led governments in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso seized the opportunity. They accused the leaders of rushing into an alliance without securing international legitimacy. International observers in Europe and the United States echoed these doubts, publishing opinion pieces suggesting that the AES project was fragile and lacking recognition. In diplomatic circles, hesitation appeared. Some officials in neighboring African states questioned whether aligning too closely with the AES might bring instability. The disinformation had achieved its goal. It created pressure on governments at home and suspicion abroad, making the new union appear weaker than it truly was. Yet, the same storm that threatened to undermine the AES also stirred resilience. As clarifications emerged from Mali's Ministry of Security and later from the European and Chinese embassies, citizens began to see that the rumors were not grounded in fact. Many realized that the very existence of such attacks proved something important. The passport mattered. In Ouagadougou, young professionals expressed pride that their region had produced a document strong enough to attract international attention. In Bamako, student organizations rallied to defend the legitimacy of the AES, holding forums to explain the difference between administrative delays and outright rejection. These conversations began to strengthen public understanding of how international recognition truly works. On the political stage, what had seemed like a liability began to turn into a strength. Leaders such as President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, and General Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger used the crisis to emphasize their core message, that Africa must not bow to external pressure. Their defiance resonated with citizens who had grown weary of Western dominance. Rather than losing credibility, they gained stature as defenders of national pride. Diplomatically, the governments of the AES were able to demonstrate a rare kind of agility. By issuing clear statements, by engaging foreign embassies directly, and by ensuring that technical delays were addressed, they proved they could navigate international politics with competence. This boosted their standing among other African nations, considering closer cooperation with the Sahel bloc. Thus, the rumors left a paradoxical legacy. They inflicted fear and doubt among ordinary citizens, and they provided ammunition to political critics. Yet, in the long term, they also galvanized popular support and gave AES leaders the chance to appear not as victims of disinformation, but as champions of resilience and sovereignty. From Washington to Brussels, the AES passport controversy became more than a regional issue. For policymakers in the United States and Europe, the narrative was simple. The sudden wave of rumors was yet another sign of Russian interference. In official briefings, European Union officials suggested that Moscow was using African media platforms to spread false news designed to discredit Europe and deepen anti-Western sentiment. The message was clear. Africans, in their eyes, could not possibly have generated such defiance on their own. This framing revealed much about the Western mindset. To suggest that Russia was behind the AES passport rumors was to imply that Africans lacked agency, that their anger toward centuries of exploitation and paternalism could only exist if fueled by outsiders. Such assumptions carried a quiet insult. They dismissed the lived history of colonization, resource extraction, and broken promises that had shaped African resentment long before Russia ever entered the stage. American analysts added their own perspective. Some think tanks in Washington warned that the AES represented a dangerous precedent, proof that African states were willing to break away from Western-led institutions like ECOWAS, and instead form their own structures. Policy papers cautioned that if the AES succeeded in establishing credibility, other nations might follow, reducing US and European influence across the continent. Western media, too, played its role. Headlines in major outlets emphasized instability, portraying the AES leaders as reckless military men courting chaos. Rarely did they highlight the administrative explanations provided by consulates or the formal recognition by the International Civil Aviation Organization. Instead, the story was framed as a diplomatic failure, another sign of Africa's fragile experiments. In this way, the AES passport was not just a travel document in Western eyes. It became a battlefield of narratives, a symbol of whether Africa could stand alone, or whether it remained under the shadow of foreign influence. Outside the Western orbit, the picture looked very different. Across African cities, the passport controversy was not seen as evidence of weakness, but as proof that the Sahel Alliance had touched a nerve in global politics. Ordinary citizens recognized that if Europe and the United States were speaking so loudly about the AES, then the alliance must represent something real. In Ghana, Nigeria, and even South Africa, commentators began to ask whether the time had come to build new African-led institutions that did not depend on Western approval. In East Africa, some voices in Kenya and Tanzania praised the Sahel states for their courage, noting that administrative delays were hardly a reason to dismiss an entire diplomatic project. Globally, too, new partners paid attention. In Asia and Latin America, the AES experiment was observed with interest. The clarifications issued by China in late February 2025 reassured many that the passport had international validity. For Beijing, the issue became an opportunity to demonstrate support for African sovereignty, contrasting itself with European hesitation. This gesture, small as it may have seemed, deepened the perception that Africa had alternative partners willing to engage without conditions. Among Africans themselves, the debate took on a deeper tone. Intellectuals and journalists pointed out that the West's quickness to blame Russia revealed a colonial reflex, the assumption that Africans could not choose independence on their own. For many, this reinforced the legitimacy of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who presented himself not merely as the head of Burkina Faso, but as a voice for an entire continent's dignity. Thus, while Western capitals saw crisis, much of Africa and the wider world saw awakening. The AES Passport, far from being dismissed as invalid, became a rallying point, a reminder that the struggle for recognition is as much about perception as it is about law. And in that struggle, the Sahel Alliance had already shifted the balance. The attempt to discredit the AES Passport had aimed to weaken the alliance, to fracture trust between leaders and citizens. Yet the result was not fragmentation, it was consolidation. Once the clarifications from consulates and embassies became public, many citizens realized that the crisis had never been about the technical validity of their documents. It had been about perception. And perception, they saw, could be manipulated. This recognition sparked something new: vigilance. Community groups across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso began speaking openly about the need to protect their information space. Instead of avoiding the passport, more citizens applied for it. Officials reported that by March 2025, demand for the AES passport had increased by nearly 30% compared to its initial launch month. What was meant to discourage people had, ironically, persuaded them that the passport was a symbol worth defending. Politically, too, the alliance gained ground. The leaders of the AES were able to turn the tables, framing the rumors as proof of Western fear. "If they spread lies about us," one statement declared, "it is because they know our unity is strong." In villages and cities alike, this narrative resonated. Citizens who had once doubted now rallied, convinced that their sovereignty was under attack, and therefore more precious than ever. Among the three leaders of the Sahel Alliance, one figure began to stand out above the rest: Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Already seen by many as a young and uncompromising voice, the passport crisis elevated him further. In speeches, Traoré spoke not of setbacks but of opportunity. "We will not ask for permission to exist," he declared. "We stand because our people demand it." His defiance struck a chord not only within Burkina Faso but across Africa. For citizens weary of leaders who bowed quickly to international pressure, Traoré's words sounded like a new anthem. Intellectuals began to compare him to earlier icons of African liberation figures who had challenged colonial powers in the 20th century. On radio programs in Dakar and Lagos, callers described him as the man who refuses to kneel. Internationally, this visibility mattered. While Western media continued to portray him as a military ruler clinging to power, audiences in Africa and beyond began to see him differently, as a symbol of resistance against manipulation. For many, the twist was undeniable. The very rumors meant to discredit the AES had instead amplified Traoré's stature, placing him at the center of a wider movement for African dignity. In the end, the story of the AES passport was never just about travel. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the will of a people who refused to be silenced. From the crowded streets of Bamako to the villages of Burkina Faso, from the markets of Niamey to the halls of international diplomacy, one truth became clear: Africa's awakening cannot be contained by rumor or fear. Citizens learned that disinformation can wound, but it cannot destroy. Institutions born of courage may bend under pressure, but they do not break. And leaders who stand firm in the storm can become more than presidents or ministers. They can become symbols of a continent's longing for freedom. President Ibrahim Traoré captured this spirit when he declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free, we have stood up to claim it." The passport was proof that Africa's future would be written by Africans themselves. It was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe now to continue walking the road of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa.